Well, good day, everybody, and welcome to the Research Methods edition of 5-Minute Psych. In this 5-minute segment, we'll look at inferential statistics, or the tools that psychologists use to make conclusions about the statistical significance of their research. We'll begin with an overview of inferential statistics, and then we'll discuss what statistical significance means. Then we'll see how the inferential statistic that we use depends on our research design before looking at some of the different inferential tests that are used for each design. After we've used descriptive statistics to organize our raw data, psychologists turn to inferential statistics to make conclusions about whether our variables are truly related to each other, as with correlational research, or to see if there is a genuine difference between our groups, as with experimental research. Depending on our research design, we would choose the appropriate inferential statistic and then test for the statistical significance of the results. At the end of the day, we want to know whether our results are statistically significant. So what does it mean if your results are statistically significant? Does this mean that they're super important or that your results will definitely be published? No. All it means is that you have a very low probability that your results are due to chance alone. In psychology, researchers generally accept a 5% chance that the results they found are due to chance. So after the data is run through the appropriate inferential statistic, depending on the research design, the researcher is looking for whether the probability statistic, symbolized by little p, is greater or less than 0.05. If it's greater than 0.05, then you would say that your results are not significant. That is, the difference between your groups isn't big enough to be considered genuine, or your two variables aren't closely related enough to say that one significantly predicts the other. But if p is less than 0.05, this means that the results are significant. Now the researcher can confidently say that the groups are truly different from each other, or the variables are genuinely related to each other. So how do you know which inferential test to use to calculate whether p is greater or less than 0.05? Well, it depends on your research design. With correlational research, when you're just measuring two variables in every participant to see if the variables are related, the statistic you would calculate is called the correlation coefficient, and it's symbolized by little r. Here's the deal with r. We won't worry about how to calculate it, but trust me that mathematically it can only rest somewhere between -1 and +1. The closer it is to plus or minus 1, or the farther it is from 0, the more strongly your two variables are related to each other, and the more likely that p will be less than 0.05. But if you calculate your correlation coefficient and it's close to 0, that means that your two variables are pretty much independent and p will be greater than 0.05. With experimental research, you have different groups of participants and you're interested in whether your manipulation causes a significant difference between your groups. Again, we won't worry about how to calculate any of these inferential statistics, but I think it helps to understand them logically. Remember, we want p to be less than 0.05, or to be as small as possible. To get p to be small, you need the inferential statistic that you calculate to be as big as possible. This statistic is based on a formula that takes the difference between your groups and divides that by the variability within groups. Knowing our fractions, we know that a big number on top divided by a small number on the bottom will give us a big number for an answer. This means that if we have a big difference between the means of our groups, as well as a small variability in the scores within each group, we're much more likely to find that p is less than 0.05. Other than the difference between groups and variability within groups, p depends on the number of participants. With more people in your study, you need to find less of a difference between your groups in order to get significance. The inferential statistic we calculate for experimental research really depends on the number of groups we're comparing. If we just have two groups, then we would use a t-test as our inferential test to find our p-value. But if we have more than two groups, we would use an f-test, or an analysis of variance, to test for significance. Well, we just looked at inferential statistics, or statistics that are used to make conclusions about data. We started by discussing statistical significance, and then we examined inferential tests used for correlational and experimental research. Now, aren't you glad you had 5 minutes?